Hello, my name is Jennie Beeson, and I'm the Program Associate here at the National Youth Advocacy Coalition, and this is part 3 of your Safe Spaces training module, and this one is called Language. So make sure to get out your worksheet right now, and we will talk about how language is one of the first steps that we need to develop common words so that we can start to create safe spaces. So the objectives for this section will include how language tells the people around you how you feel, and it includes including different meanings. And once you understand these words, you can share them and practice using them. We will go over derogatory terms and also talk about good words to use. So if you want to make sure that you have your worksheet out one more time, I'll say that just so that you can follow along, and there will be some activities to prompt you with your worksheet. So I think often people don't know that they're using terms that can make others feel like outsiders, especially LGBTQ youth, but by thinking about your language, anyone can be conscientious about terms, and there's not some sort of science about it. It's really, if you take a moment to think about the assumptions that are inherent in the language that you use, then you can understand how to make your language more inclusive and make it feel less alienating to other people. So we're going to name just a few of some of the examples that I thought might be important to share. These are things that people might say that are based on assumptions that are prejudiced or alienating. And I'll just point out a few of them. In the middle there you see one says, for a blank, you speak English really well, which means, which has kind of assumptions that there's a certain kind of person that can only speak language well, or that maybe if you say for an Asian person you speak English really well, I think that that can be a racist and xenophobic kind of thing to say, since there are people who are American and speak English, and it just makes it seem like there's somebody who owns the English language, and it's condescending. And then another one that I pointed out was are you the boy or the girl in the relationship? And I think this one, if you think about it, it kind of assumes that gay relationships or queer relationships are upheld to a model of heterosexual relationships, which aren't necessarily true. So if a boy-girl relationship is the norm, then all gay relationships should be adhering to that. And obviously, that can be a really isolating thing to say. And then the other one that I wanted to kind of point out was that's so unladylike. And I think we all understand, or I hope we all understand, that whatever it means to be a lady or whatever it means to be ladylike isn't exactly fostering people's freedom of expression of their gender, and it's not challenging norms that often a lot of youth are trying to figure out their identities through. So you can take a look at these more, and you can always come back to them later as well. So with your language that's linked with alienating assumptions, it's important that we find alternatives to using these kind of things. And these are two examples of questions that I have found, or that we're using as examples for some that are alienating. So instead of saying, what are you, very often people might hear that, and there's a lot of different connotations that can come with that. But if it has to do with gender, that's what I kind of saw this one as. And so instead of asking someone, what are you, you might try and say, well, what gender pronoun do you prefer? And by pronoun, I mean he or she. Or you can say, how do you identify your gender? Instead of making someone seem like, an alien or something like that. There are other ways to ask that question, if that question really needs to be asked. If you're with somebody and you need to know how to identify their gender, I think really you should think about first why you need to know their gender, or why you're uncomfortable not putting a gender with that person. A good way to do that is also just thinking about, just use the person's name, don't use any gender pronouns. And then the other one is, do you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, or are you married? Obviously, not all people can get married, and so a better way to ask this question is, what is your relationship status, or are you partnered? These are just different ways of asking the same question, but not assuming someone's sexuality or gender identity. So now we're going to turn to your worksheet. So I'll have you push pause after I'm done explaining, and you can write down a list of terms, phrases, or questions that might be used in your space or that you've heard around you that might be similar to the ones we just looked at, that might be prejudiced or that might make unfair or prejudiced assumptions. And you can see in your worksheet it has it on one side, the damaging words or phrases, and then on the other side you can write alternative inclusive words or phrases. Now you don't, we are going to start talking about other language, so you might even want to wait to fill this in once we're going through other terms and language that you can use, and you can always come back to that. So go ahead and push pause now and then come back. So I just said we're going to talk about the terms and the language, and I think this will help to create your list of alternatives, and also it really, once you start using these words and saying these words more often, there's a way you can become more powerful or feel more powerful with them and use them more comfortably to create a space around you that is easier to talk with or talk about, being safe for LGBTQ youth and their spaces. Before I get into exactly what these terms might be, I want to make sure that there's 3 things to keep in mind before we get into the meat of terminology. The first one is all these terms that I'm going to show you, these are all working definitions. So of course, this is what I mean when I say them, and there might be other people who have different meanings. And so this is just, this definition, the definitions could change, but for right now, I think these are pretty appropriate. So like I said, they're also subject to change. At any point, it could turn into something else, and that is totally fine as people find their identities and find different words they want to use to describe themselves. And then the last thing, they might not mean the same things to all people in geographic areas. So something that might seem appropriate for me to use in Washington, D.C., might not be appropriate for someone in Texas, or might not be appropriate for someone in Missouri or California. And so we have to keep in mind that these are not universal definitions, and they're by no means universal terms either. And you might find even there's large differences between U.S. terms and any other terms that are used throughout the world. So keep that in mind. So here are some starting terms, and this is by no means a total list, but helps to illustrate the diversity of identities that might be included in what we call the LGBTQ community. And so I want you to go ahead and get out your worksheet. The next section in your worksheet kind of has a list of terms and spaces next to it so that you can follow along and take notes. So on the left-hand side, we have a list of terms that we're going to go into more in depth. And on the right-hand side, we have lists of terms that I think are also important to point out, but they might not be the universal ideas of what, well, they might not all be considered at all points within the community, or they will be considered in the community. Obviously, if we had plenty of all the time in the world, I would have given us full definitions on all of them. So just on the right side, I want to go through asexual, which is pretty, sounds like what it is. It's somebody without sex, somebody who doesn't experience sexual attraction or doesn't want to act on sexual attraction if they have any. Allies, we will talk more about allies, but those are people who are willing to advocate for LGBTQ folks in the community, and oftentimes they're included within what we call the community. We're going to talk about pansexual more later. Two-spirit is an indigenous word talking about a person who feels that they have two spirits within themselves, like two gendered spirits within themselves. There's gender nonconforming, which is just kind of an umbrella term, which is exactly as it sounds, somebody who doesn't conform to gender standards. And then the down low I thought was one that should be included on here because it talks about folks who might not identify as lesbian or gay, but they still act on same gender sex or same gender loving, and so that one I thought was important to add. So here are the terms that we can cover within the time limit of this training, and I tried to be as comprehensive as I could. And I want to stress first why I have these all separated, and that's to help have them be included in bites that we can go through more readily. And so we have biological sex, gender presentation, gender identity, and sexuality. So I think it's important to note that there are people who might have a different identity or fit in a different space in each of the four categories and be empowered by their identities. And we have to think about all of these things as separate. So, for example, there might be someone who is biologically male, who has a gender presentation of masculine and a gender identity of man, and he might be gay, right? So we can have people who choose all these different identities and presentations within all these categories. So I want to make sure to keep that in mind as we're going through. And if you have further questions on this, I do encourage you to write down your questions and then share them with me as well. And of course, follow along with your worksheet so you can write down the questions that you do have. So first we're going to start out with biological sex. And what makes up your biological sex is your chromosomes, your reproductive system, and your hormones, and these are all usually assigned at birth. So the first one that I have here is female, and that's a person with the biological characteristics that are categorized as female, usually assigned at birth. And so that just has to do with your physical body. The next one, male, which means a person with the biological characteristics that are categorized as male, usually assigned at birth. And those things are the testes, the chromosomes of male, and testosterone as hormones.